The Ballad of the Mountain Millionaire. This is the story of a man named Jed, a humble mountaineer who lived a simple life. For many years, he struggled to provide for his kin, barely keeping his family fed as they dwelt among the rugged hills. One afternoon, while Jed was out hunting to put food on the table, a strange thing happened. He fired his gun at some game, and from the ground beneath him, a bubbling crude began to rise. It was oil, that dark and mysterious substance often called black gold or Texas tea. Before anyone could say a word, old Jed became a millionaire. His relatives and neighbors gathered around, amazed by the sudden change in fortune. His kinfolk told him that he must move away from the hills. They insisted that California was the place he ought to be. And so, the family loaded up their old truck and moved to a place called Beverly Hills. It was a world of swimming pools and movie stars, a far cry from the mountains they once called home. These were the people known as the Beverly Hillbillies. A new life and a strange fear. On a bright morning in their new home, Jed looked out at the day and spoke to his dogs, remarking on how pretty they looked. Paul, a friend of the family, was nearby. Jed suspected that Mark Templeton must be coming over to visit his daughter, Ellie Mae. Ellie confirmed this, explaining that Mark was fetching her a scuba suit because he was going to teach her how to be a frogwoman. Jed observed that the two young people seemed to be hitting it off quite well, and Ellie admitted she liked Mark a lot. However, there was one problem. Granny did not like Mark. Jed tried to defend the young man, saying Granny probably liked him but just did not understand what he did for a living. Mark was a Navy frogman, a profession Granny had never heard of before. Because of this, she constantly told him to stay out of the water. Like many elderly people who had never learned to swim, Granny was deathly afraid of the water, and Jed hoped she would eventually stop worrying about him. Meanwhile, Miss Jane Hathaway was driving Granny home after a visit to a specialist. Granny thanked Miss Jane for taking her to see a man named Dr. Klingler. Miss Jane assured her that he was a fine psychiatrist, and if anyone could help Granny with her bad dreams, he could. Granny insisted it was more than just bad dreams. She was terrified that every time Mark Templeton dunked himself in the water, he turned into a frog. Miss Jane tried to explain that being a frogman was simply Mark's career in the Navy. Granny wondered why he could not have joined the army instead, though she worried that if he had, he might have gone underground and turned into a gopher man. Miss Jane urged Granny not to let it worry her, but told her to return to Dr. Klingler if the nightmares continued. The Great Frog Confusion. Once home, Granny encountered a frog in a small cage. Believing it was actually Mark, she spoke to the creature, pleading with it to stay out of the cement pond. She felt she was too old for such foolishness. When she found Ellie Mae alone, she asked the girl if she missed Mark. Ellie said she did. Granny promised her that she would see him again, tall and handsome in his uniform, if only Ellie would take the frog out of the cage and kiss it. Ellie Mae felt silly about the idea, but Granny insisted, worried that if the frog stayed in the cage, it might swell up and burst. Eventually, Ellie took the cage outside. She apologized to the frog for Granny hauling it around and told it that it could hop down to the cement pond for a swim. Just then, the Real Mark Templeton arrived with scuba gear. He greeted Ellie and asked about the frog in the cage. Ellie explained it was Granny's pet frog, whom she had named Mark. Mark felt somewhat flattered, but mostly confused. Ellie mentioned that Granny wanted her to kiss the frog, hoping it would turn into a prince. Mark joked that he did not need that kind of competition. Granny appeared and, seeing Mark in his human form, thanked Ellie for what she thought was another miracle. She promised to try and keep him out of the water so she would not have to bother anyone anymore. Mark, unaware of Granny's delusions, mentioned he was going to get into a swimming suit to teach Ellie how to swim underwater. Granny panicked. She begged them to stay away from the water. Mark tried to reassure her, but Granny was convinced that the water caused his brain to shrink and his body to change. When Mark and Ellie headed toward the pool anyway, Granny lost her temper. She jumped onto Mark's back, refusing to let go, determined to stop her granddaughter from becoming a frog woman. Chaos at the mansion. The commotion drew the attention of Jed and Jethro. They found Granny riding Mark like a horse. Jed ordered Jethro to take Granny to her room and lock her in so she could calm down. Jethro, being a strong young man with a sixth-grade education, did as he was told, despite Granny's protests and name-calling. In a fever dream or a moment of extreme stress, Granny imagined a wedding ceremony. In her mind, Ellie Mae was marrying Mark, but Mark was a frog. A judge was there to perform the ceremony, and even in her dream, Granny tried to stop it. She yelled that the groom was a frogman who would change shape if he got wet. Jethro, acting as the best man, claimed the groom was running late because he wanted to take a shower. Granny cried out for someone to stop him, but it was too late. In her vision, the wedding proceeded, and the judge pronounced them frog and wife. Granny woke up from her nightmare screaming for help. Jed came to her side, asking if Ellie and the frogman had married yet. When he told her no, Granny felt a great sense of relief. Jed tried to get her to take a tranquilizer and rest, hoping to ease her troubled mind. Schemes and scuba suits. While Granny rested, Mr. Drysdale, the banker, was talking with Miss Jane. They discussed the romance between Ellie Mae and the Navy lieutenant. Drysdale realized that if Mark married Ellie, he would be part of a family worth $40 million. Suddenly, Drysdale decided he loved the boy like a son and needed to get on his good side. He planned to use his devious nature to win Mark over. Drysdale approached Mark while wearing Navy fatigues, pretending to be an old sailor himself. He claimed to have seen action in many famous battles, like Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal. Mark was skeptical, remembering how poorly Drysdale had treated him when they first met. Drysdale explained that he had spent 5 years taking orders from young officers, and seeing the uniform made him see red. Mark accepted the apology, and they shook hands. Back at the mansion, Granny was still struggling. Jethro tried to cheer her up by reading from a book by an old friend from back home named Jim Owen. The book was full of funny stories about fishing and life, but Granny did not want to hear anything about things that came out of the water. Jethro eventually found 2 frogs by the cement pond and brought them to Granny, thinking they would be good company. Granny, however, was heartbroken. She believed the 2 frogs were actually Mark and Ellie Mae who had gone into the water against her wishes. She decided there was only one thing to do: take them to Dr. Klingler. The doctor's office and the final resolution. Granny arrived at the doctor's office with the 2 frogs. She introduced them as Mark and Ellie Mae. Dr. Klingler, trying to be patient, listened as Granny explained that the 2 wanted to get married. The doctor played along, suggesting that a ceremony might not be necessary for frogs, but Granny insisted that her granddaughter was a decent, church-going girl who deserved a beautiful wedding. Granny told the doctor he had to turn the 2 frogs back into a handsome lieutenant and a beautiful girl. She left them there, telling the doctor to have Mississippi Jane drive them home once he had earned his fee. Dr. Klingler was left alone, wondering how to handle such a unique situation. Back at the house, Jed was frustrated that Jethro had let Granny leave. But soon, Ellie Mae and Mark returned from the pool, perfectly human and happy. Miss Jane arrived shortly after with Granny. When Granny saw Mark and Ellie standing there, she was overjoyed, believing the doctor had performed a miracle. She thanked everyone and prepared to go lay down, exhausted from the day's events. However, before she left, she made them promise never to go near the water again. Mark, not realizing the gravity of her fear, mentioned that he was giving Ellie another lesson in the morning. The cycle began again as Granny, driven by her protective instincts and her misunderstanding of the word frogman, jumped on Mark's back once more. Jed had to step in again, trying to pull her off as the family continued their eccentric, wealthy, and often confusing life in Beverly Hills. Through all the misunderstandings and the bubbling crude, they remained a family bound by love and a very unique way of looking at the world.